And thank you very much for joining us this morning. It's great to see the numbers that are coming in because I think it's going to be very informative and worthwhile to explain exactly what we are doing for the region and how we continue to try and position ourselves in a way that not only in the crisis phase, but also post-crisis. So two things I'd like to focus on. One is foreign direct investment and trade as my first topic, and the second one is with regards to collaboration, because I think those are two key themes that I would like to just highlight. The first one, as you can appreciate, foreign direct investment and trade is not what it was before COVID-19 and will not be exactly what it was before after COVID-19. That said, some deals are sliding to the right because companies are entrenching and are not willing to make investment decisions. Some companies are no longer in a position to make investment decisions. But I will also say there are other opportunities in certain sectors that are continuing to present themselves. So all in all, I would say it's not exactly negative news. It's not exactly positive news, but we continue to work hard on our investment and trade opportunities. But I will say that many decisions are going to be sliding to the right until people get to understand what exactly the new normal in the investment space is going to look like. That said, we are instituting a number of initiatives that are still trying to create a buzz about the region in market. So for example, we are hosting a webinar with a group out of Hong Kong, so they get to see what the Edmonton Metropolitan Region is all about. And we are also executing and activating more fully our opportunities with people like the Pearl River Delta Canadian Chamber, where we have an MOU and to be able to exchange opportunities between those two groupings out of Guangzhou. So things continue, but I will say that they are rather bearish, not bullish, if to use the financial terms. In terms of collaboration, the big point that comes out of collaboration is tools and things that we had put in place as a region back when Edmonton Global started are really coming to the full front of activation during this crisis. And I just wanted to thank all those that participate, from the shareholders to businesses to, in particular, our partners as well, including the institutions that are all now really pulling in the same direction and sharing information that's making this region better prepared to come out of this crisis. A couple of things that of note: as you know, I'm the chair of the CCCA, or the Consider Canada City Alliance, the 12 largest economies across Canada. We have submitted a letter to the federal government, and we're just waiting for a response on things that we think can be done locally that will create a competitive advantage for us globally. I am also in a small group of all my peers across the province. So think Wood Buffalo, Calgary, ourselves, and Travel Alberta, as well as Alberta Innovates. And we are preparing a letter that hopefully by the end of next week will be ready to go into the provincial government. That will provide some inputs that we think they need to consider for the recovery phase. And then finally, organizationally, we have been working through at a board level, including the management team as well as our shareholders, some of the inputs in terms of a pathway to growth, as we're calling it. So how do we move from crisis to stabilization, recovery, to the new normal, whatever that looks like, back into a growth phase? So these planning activities that we're doing are now being incorporated to the work that we see at a go-forward basis. So without further ado, I'd like to sort of hand off more from a regional perspective of what we're doing to Lynette. So thank you very much, and I'll be here all through the conference to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Malcolm. I'll cover some of what we're doing from a regional perspective more towards the end, but as well as our Road to Recovery white paper. We're going to kick it off a little bit with an overview of the economic impacts of COVID to date. So things have been changing on an hourly and daily basis, but the numbers that we'll be presenting you are the most recent that we've found. So this is accurate as of today. So we'll highlight, as I mentioned, some local and provincial economic impacts, and then shift to look at some of the more major impacts and trends from a global perspective, and conclude by summarizing our recommendations to the provincial government for mitigating the economic impacts, but also for setting the conditions for a strong economic recovery. From a regional and certainly a provincial perspective, the economic impacts of COVID-19 are compounded by the impacts of the global oil price crash. From a provincial perspective, food service, tourism, energy, and airline industries were most immediately impacted, but we are also now seeing impacts across all sectors, given the containment measures affecting both supply and demand. The latest aspect we are monitoring closely are the closures of beef and pork processing plants across Canada and the US that will have a significant impact on our agriculture industries. Alberta's unemployment rate for 2020 is forecasted to be the second highest in the country at an average of 12%. And the Western Canada Select is changing on an hourly and daily basis, but this is what it was as of yesterday. So Alberta is expected to see the biggest contraction in GDP of all the Canadian provinces. And as I mentioned, particularly given the compounding factor of oil prices. So you can see Alberta here compared to the rest of the provinces in Canada in terms of an estimation of GDP. From a more regional perspective, Edmonton's employment levels are expected to decline faster than Calgary's, but that's primarily due to the types of jobs being impacted. COVID-19 is affecting all industries of the economy across all sectors and all businesses regardless of size. But one thing that our research has shown is that traditionally small and micro businesses, which are less than 100 employees, are most at risk of closure during a crisis. And those are the types of businesses that make up a large portion of the Edmonton region economy. Shifting a little bit more globally, Canada's trade flows are expected to be severely disrupted for a good part of 2020. Disruptions to the global supply chains, declining business confidence and investment, and a major contraction in the US economic growth are impacting trade flows and the growth prospects for Canada's export sector this year. But there is a little bit of good news on the horizon. Assuming the virus is successfully contained by the end of Q3 2020, which is right now the assumption, a resurgence of trade activity is expected in 2021 as the pandemic and its effects start to subside, and trade activity will slowly return to normal or some semblance of normal through 2021. I mentioned supply chain disruption, and from the perspective of the increase of globalization, what that's done is it's shifted the structure of the economy over time to a point where long distance travel, face-to-face interactions, cross-border commuting, and geographically expansive supply chains are very commonplace. And that's increased the interdependence between countries for important goods and services. The example that we give here, which is a very timely example, is the pharmaceutical supply chain. So drugs get manufactured from component parts made all over the world. Somebody made the analogy to me, much like cars are. And so you get the car components from all over the world, but the cars are assembled in a certain jurisdiction. Very few of the drugs sold and used in Canada are made in Canada. And Canada is not only the world's 13th largest importer of pharmaceutical products, but most of our pharmaceutical imports do come from the United States. And though the drugs are assembled in the United States, the raw materials come in large proportion from China, as you'll see from this slide here. India is one of the world's largest pharmaceutical manufacturers as well, and Indian pharma companies get almost 70% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients for their medicines from China. So the interdependence means that any disruption to one country's supply chain affects the entire world's supply of pharmaceutical products. And that's exactly what we've been seeing playing out over the past couple of months. As countries around the world experience the spread of COVID-19 at different times and at differing rates of intensity, the global supply chain will be in a constant state of flux. In the short term, these disruptions are promoting protectionist measures. Started in China Canada's second largest trading partner. Then Europe and Italy followed suit. Then India put a series of measures in place. And most recently now the US, as we're probably all very well aware of by watching the news. Basically, as of April 2nd, 68 countries in total have curbed exports of personal protective equipment or medicine. But I think it's important to note that Canada is not among them. We have not restricted any exports. But there are, as you can see from this map and from the various protectionist measures that have ensued, geopolitical tensions across the board. So over the medium term, we're likely to see relocalization among many nations looking to repatriate large parts of their medical supply chains. The United States and France have already made public statements and certain moves to that effect. So that's a trend that we're watching fairly closely. From a foreign direct investment perspective, the outbreak and spread of COVID-19 has caused a dramatic drop in global foreign direct investment and global capital flows. Estimates now suggest that the downward pressure on foreign direct investment could be 30 to 40% during 2020 and 2021. Sectors that were hardest hit include energy, automotive, and airline sectors. Tourism and retail were also quite hard hit from an FDI perspective. The decline that you'll see in greenfield foreign direct investment, which is net new bricks and mortar type projects, is a trend that was already occurring before the outbreak of COVID and will likely continue to decline post-COVID, especially given a tense geopolitical environment. They're looking at that being higher risk. Global investment and capital flows will eventually resume though. However, they may not return as strong across all sectors. So we're monitoring which sectors we see movement in. Initially, foreign capital will likely be looking for a safe landing spot, which is where keeping an eye on insolvencies and bankruptcies could lead to potential opportunities for mergers and acquisitions. And also because governments around the world will likely be including infrastructure investments in their stimulus and recovery measures, and those are things that we're certainly recommending to the provincial and federal government, foreign investment into P3 projects could present a really unique emergent opportunity for our region. In terms of sector and market trends from a stock market perspective, spending by consumers drives so much of our economic activity. And as a result of the containment measures taken to prevent any further spread of the virus, consumer demand as well as supply has been mostly halted across the board, and economic activity is nearly frozen globally for the time being. The double threat to consumer supply and demand has led to this outpacing previous global stock market shocks, such as the Great Depression and the 2008 global financial crisis. As you'll see here, the COVID pandemic as of January 2020 had already surpassed them. All companies and sectors on the stock market are being hit by the current crisis, but not all of them are being hit to the same degree and in the same way. So if you look at some of the micro trends, there are hints of resiliency and near-term or even future growth opportunities. So some examples that I can offer is in the automotive industry. So though they've been one of the sectors hardest hit and most negatively impacted, the virus outbreak is not expected to hit their spending on research into advanced technologies such as autonomous driving and electric cars. And then we see a lot of growth in, for example, video conferencing platforms like Zoom. Zoom doubled its value in March 2020. No surprise given that we're all using it right now. Amazon is ramping up employment to meet soaring demand from consumers. Social media companies are reporting spikes in activities, Netflix and video game makers as well. Over the long haul, the biggest stock market winners are going to be companies that defy the status quo and introduce new disruptive technologies that create entirely new industries and products in their sectors. So that's essentially what's happening now, but how can we predict how much more severe this could get or how much longer it might go on and when recovery will begin, and when it begins, whether we will see growth at the same levels as pre-crisis. And that's where economic shock geometry comes in. Sometimes it's referred to as recession shapes, but we don't like to use the R word, so we call it shock geometry. As you can see, the shapes take their names from the appropriate or approximate shape the economic data makes in the graphs. So the V shape is where the economy suffers a sharp but brief period of economic decline, followed by a strong recovery. A U shape is a longer period of decline where GDP may shrink for several quarters and only slowly return to trend growth. A W shape is known as a double dip recession, where the economy falls into recession, recovers with a short period of growth, then falls back into recession before finally fully recovering. And an L shape, which is what we don't want to happen, is when an economy has a severe recession and does not return to trendline growth for many years, if ever. What we've got on the screen here is what happened in the 2008 global financial crisis. In 2008, Canada actually fared comparatively really well. As you'll see, Canada had more of a V-shaped, very small V-shaped recovery. The United States suffered more of a U-shaped recovery, and Greece never did recover. Part of the reason, and a large part of the reason Canada fared fairly well, was because early and effective government policy intervention prevented a banking crisis. However, the COVID crisis is certainly unique, as we talked about from the stock market perspective. So this is a really messy, ugly graph, but I'll explain it a little bit. The shape of the economic shock from COVID-19 will actually be dependent on two key variables. The first is whether we can rapidly and effectively control the spread of the virus. And the second is effective economic policy interventions. If you have one without the other, you're not going to be able to control the economic shock. Most expected the shock to look like one of the scenarios in 2, 3, 5, or 6, a deep V or possibly U shape. However, the scenario in each jurisdiction will vary dependent upon the ability to control the spread of the virus and implement policies to mitigate the impact. And it's changing day by day. As jurisdictions begin to lift containment measures and reopen parts or all of their economy, a second wave of infection may hit. As we're seeing, Saskatchewan is looking to reopen parts of their economy as early as May 4th. And other countries around the world have already started some of the reopening. So if this happens and it forces a recontainment, it'll send the economy into a second shock wave as well. So that could result in more of a W-shaped recession like number 8 or number 9. And often with pandemics, the second wave is more severe than the first. So from an economic perspective, containment is a necessary precondition to recovery, but the second precondition, as I've mentioned, is implementing a strong policy response to prevent structural damage and to create resiliency in our economy. There's no policy playbook here for what we're experiencing, but as Malcolm mentioned at the beginning, we have developed some suggestions for the provincial government on measures they can take in the immediate term to help strengthen and protect our economy. As a trade-dependent province and country, foreign direct investment and global trade will continue to be strong components of our economy. Not just because that's Edmonton Global's mandate, that's backed up by our economic research as well. So policy measures must be focused on protecting our export capabilities, our supply chain, and our talent pool to ensure businesses and the economy can return to scale quickly once the global economy restarts. Stimulus measures also need to be focused on infrastructure and investments that not only bring meaningful value to Albertans, but also generate a high impact and return for the province's economy. What we've been saying to the provincial government is it's not just about economic activity, it's also about a lasting economic impact, which is why you'll see we've recommended that they invest significantly and completely in digital infrastructure, such as broadband and 5G technology. We also think it's critically important that we close the productivity gap that we have with the rest of the world. A big part of why we have a productivity gap is that our businesses and institutions have not been adopting technology as fast as our global peers. There are two key barriers that businesses have identified in doing so. One is cost, the other is talent and skills. So we've asked the government to remove those barriers and offer financial support to businesses in adopting technology and new digital tools that can increase their productivity and global competitiveness, but also to top up the Canada-Alberta Job Grant to ensure that those businesses can upskill and reskill their people to meet those needs at no immediate cost or additional cost to them. So one thing that I'd like to leave you all with before we shift into the question and answer period, because I know that some of this has been fairly heavy, is that we do see a reason for hope and optimism. We've seen some incredible ingenuity and perseverance from businesses in our region over these past few months, but also from our partners in the economic development ecosystem. Every week, members of your economic development teams, chambers of commerce, universities and colleges, industry associations, and businesses and economic development agencies like us, about 90 organizations in total. Every week we gather virtually to share best practices, to share ideas for supporting business and recovery, and to work together on what's next. It is making a difference, and it's the kind of thinking and collective action that will ensure a strong recovery for our region. So we just want to take this moment to thank you for being a part of it. So I thank you for your patience in listening to me talk about economics and policy for the past 25 minutes. We're going to end the recording now, and we'll switch to the Q&A portion of the briefing. We wanted to ensure that we had plenty of time for not only questions, but for input and information that you have from your own communities and your own experiences